The next type of question really is just a variation on the format of the ones we've seen already. And that's the selection list question. And really all this does, it allows you to phrase a question and to give a set of options in the form of a pull-down menu rather than displaying them all on the page at the same time. And this can be very useful for questions that have a lot of possible responses. Again, if you think that listing, say, 20 or so possible responses is going to crowd the page a little bit, you can just put it in a pull-down menu instead. But I'm just going to demonstrate it with a shorter question, which is the education question, which we will repeat using this using the pull-down system. And again, you can write this in one of two ways. You can add in the responses here by clicking in the response field add answer option, or you can write them in list form here. I'm going to do it the second way this time since we did it using this option the first time. And we will just give the shorter version of these, which is primary, secondary, third level. And we'll add the question. And you'll notice that now if we compare this one to the one above, it looks pretty identical. You'll see that the button has changed, right? We use these little symbols that show that this question is a selection list and that this question is a multiple choice. For our multiple answer ones, you can see we have a checkbox rather than a radio button. So now if we go into preview survey, you'll see that the respondent is presented with a question that looks like this. And this can be a slightly neater format. If we have a lot of questions or a small number of questions that have a really long list of response sets, it can kind of crowd up the screen a bit. So if we do it like this, the respondent has the option to pick one from a pull down menu. Another type of question you might ask is about significant dates or times or things like that. Most common one you might ask someone is you want to get their age. And there's a tendency in survey analysis to give these questions in the form of sort of brackets where you say is your age between the age of, let's say, 15 to 20, 21 to 25. And that's fine, but it's not always a good option from the point of view of preserving detail in the question responses. If you get that age in a number, it's always better. You can always collapse that down afterwards and create categories out of it, but you can't recover that information if you ask someone to give their age in the form of brackets. Ethically, of course, from a data collection point of view, you probably don't want to be asking people their birthdays. You could just ask them to indicate their year of birth. But let's say we did have a question that did require a precise date. Then we could ask a question like this. And you see there's a couple of advanced options we can give it as required. If some of these are demographic questions that you want the respondents to answer, you can set it as mandatory or not. But quite often we're not going to want to use these. You can see this one here now asks for a date. What is your birthday? And when we go in here, you'll see that it gives it, or they're given the option. They can click out here to this expanded calendar, which will allow them to select their birth year. They can scroll through it manually, or they can write it in here like this using / and using the format that's provided. You could also use a question like this to ask people to indicate the date that they joined something. And you can also put a qualifier in the question to say that if you're not comfortable listing the precise date, then you could just give it to within the range of a month. If you wanted to know when they joined a society, when they started doing a particular activity or something like that. When we return, you'll see that there's a number of there's two principal ways that we can do this. We can give them a date question or we can give them a time question. And the time question looks kind of like the previous one. So if we were to put in a placeholder question here that asks what time did you, and we can actually manipulate some of the settings here if we want to give a range, but I'll just show you first of all what it looks like if we don't set any of those options. Now we can see here from the buttons we've got a time question and we've got a date question. And if we go into preview survey, you'll see that down here the respondent is able to give a particular time. You could also ask them how long they spent on something and it'll return it in that format, in the form of hours and minutes. And this can be good if you want to collect information in the form of, let's say if you're doing media use surveys, you might ask them how many hours and minutes per day do they spend doing something, and they can report it in time format. Or alternatively, if you wanted to ask someone how much time they spend on something, you could simply give them one of these questions here, which is the single line free text question, and they can write their answer in the form of a number. How many hours per week do you spend reading newspapers? How many hours per day do you spend on the internet? Do you spend on your phone? And the way that JISC is going to compile the data for you then is that as long as you specify clearly in the question that you want them to write, give their response in the form of just a number with no additional text, and it'll collect that information for you, and you can easily transfer it over to whatever program you're going to use for analysis. And so for this section, we'll just look at the final type of question we might want to do, which is the single or multiple line free text question. These are the same thing, just one gives a longer response option than the other. Single line free text question is where you can write in a question and you can ask the respondent to give you some additional detail. So you can now say, please give more details about whatever that might be. When we add the question, you see here now we have T in the form of text, single line free text. They'll have a small space which will limit the character count, that will allow them to write in something. You'll see here it gives them just this much space over here. If we wanted to give them a longer form, and again there is rationale sometimes for using this restricted form. If you want the respondent to be concise about something, it makes more sense to limit their space if it's something that can be described in a very short space of time. But if not, if you want to ask them to give a follow-up or more detail, in reality a lot of people doing surveys tend to give short responses to these types of things anyway. If you want to give a longer one, you can use the multi-line free text question. And you'll see here that all this does, once we add it, is it gives the respondent a little bit more space to write in what their opinion is, so they can actually pull down this little text box here and they can use multiple lines and give a much longer answer. So these are some more ones that you might want to use: the pull down format, the date reporting, time reporting, and the sort of open format single or multi-line response questions.